Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin with Jurassic Magic, and in today's video, I wanted to make the ultimate dragon deck using Ureni of the Unwritten, and this is the video I was most looking forward to making in Tarkir Dragonstorm. For such a long time, I've wanted to make a Teamer Dragon. That's not Miirym, by the way. And honestly, I gotta say, this dragon is very cool. It reminds me a little bit of a Godzilla mixed in with a bear, because with some of the art pieces, it just looks like Godzilla with wings, which to me is amazing, and this is a great dragon commander. And surprisingly, it's the only dragon commander in the entire set that focuses on dragons. All the other dragon commanders focus on different things, which I guess kind of makes sense. They focus on their individual clans and their type of game strategy. However, Ureni of the Unwritten focuses specifically on dragons, which again, I am most hyped for, and most likely you are too if you clicked on this video. And just as a quick reminder, if you like what I'm doing here on YouTube, consider joining my Patreon, as there's a lot of great benefits as I post early videos, help you with deck advice, and much more. And if you are looking for any of these singles that I talk about today with all these dragons, definitely click on my TCG player affiliate link. All you have to do is click on it, go to the website, order the singles you want, and that's really it. And lastly, if you want to join a great community that talks all about Magic, consider joining my Discord. But going back into this deck tech with Ureni of the Unwritten, there's a lot of ways to brew around him, and I'm super excited. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's jump right into it. So I already discussed Ureni of the Unwritten in a previous video. It was actually one of my first videos for Tarkir Dragonstorm, mainly because I was super excited for it. That video was more about a first impression, along with some cards that you may want to add into the deck, but that video was made before the precon was spoiled. And of course, there's a lot of cool cards in the precon, along with other cards that were spoiled after that I wanted to throw in this video. But before I get any further, I do want to first read Ureni of the Unwritten, just so that we could get a basis of what this does. For 4 green, blue, and a red, it's a legendary creature, Spear Dragon. It has flying and trample. Whenever Ureni enters or attacks, look at the top 8 cards of your library. You may put a dragon creature card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and it has a 7/7 body, which is the lucky magical number for commander damage, because 3 swings away makes it lethal to one opponent. So the more I studied this commander and the more I looked at the options as far as power level goes, I believe it is more explosive than Miirym Sentinel Worm. And I know you guys are probably going to rush towards the comments and type in how wrong I am, but hear me out. And hopefully by this video, I can explain maybe why you should consider Ureni over Miirym. I feel like for one, it does something right away on the battlefield, where Miirym, you have to put it on the battlefield and wait maybe an extra turn or two to get another dragon on the battlefield to clone it. However, I feel like with Ureni of the Unwritten, its ceiling is a lot more higher than Miirym after some playtesting. For one, Ureni is pretty abusable for itself. Miirym, you abuse it with other dragons and clone strategies, but Ureni puts dragons directly on the battlefield by chaining them in. Of course, this is not necessarily a video about Miirym versus Ureni, but I did want to mention that quickly. So what exactly is this video about? Well, it's about making the best dragon deck possible with Ureni of the Unwritten helmed as the commander. So first, I want to talk about the basics and talk about ramp and card draw and talk about the right type of lands you should put in this deck, because it's a dragon deck after all. They are going to be pretty high in CMC, so you'll definitely want some of the best ramp options you could include. The ones I personally like are low in CMC, like 3 visits, Nature's Lore. These will help ensure that we can search our library for any forest, whether they're a triome like Ketria Triome, a shock land, or a dual land. And the best part is they enter the battlefield untapped, so that if you want to cast another ramp spell or hold up mana for a counter spell, you have that option. I will say also, nothing feels better playing a commander game, casting that 3 visits on turn 1 or turn 2, then on the following turn follow up with a ramp spell that is 4 CMC like Skyshroud Claim, where it's essentially a 3 visits, but instead of searching for 1 land, you're searching for 2 lands that are forests and putting them on the battlefield untapped unless they have a tap clause. There is also another exciting ramp option for dragons, specifically with Encroaching Dragonstorm. I'm super excited about this. This is why I have a lot of basics in this type of deck. When this enchantment enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And the next part is really what I'm looking forward to with this type of card. Whenever a dragon you control enters, return this enchantment to its owner's hand. So this is the type of ramp spell I love in this type of deck. It works very well with Dragonback Assault, which by the way is also in the deck, and I feel like you don't necessarily need it in the deck, but I feel like this is almost like a a 2-card combo you could utilize to put a bunch of dragons on the battlefield, because if you have Dragonback Assault on the battlefield, whenever a land you control enters, create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying, and if you ramped with Encroaching Dragonstorm, you're making 2 dragons on the battlefield, and you get to return Encroaching Dragonstorm back to your hand. Repeat the process for as long as you have the mana for it. So not only will this provide a ton of ramp for us, this will also provide a ton of dragons as well. I will also say there's a ton of other ramp in this deck, not just the ones I highlighted, so Dragonback Assault will be even better. But this does bring me to my next topic: what kind of lands do you want to put in this type of deck? I did mention previously that I'm running a ton of basics in here because of some synergies with Encroaching Dragonstorm and other options like that. I do have a mix of fetch lands in this deck along with shock lands, and because I have the dual lands, I put them in here as well. Obviously you could replace them with other lands, but I prefer lands that can be searched with other cards like 3 visits or even Rampant Growth. However, in this kind of deck, there are some great utility lands that are really good that'll help synergize with dragons specifically. There is a cycle of Spirit Dragon lands like Crucible of the Spirit Dragon, Haven of the Spirit Dragon, and Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon. Each of these are perfect for dragon decks. Let's start off first with Crucible of the Spirit Dragon. I don't think it's as good as the other ones, but it's still pretty decent. It adds for a colorless, or you could pay 1 and tap it, put a storage counter on Crucible of the Spirit Dragon. Then if you have enough storage counters on it, you could tap it, remove X storage counters from Crucible of the Spirit Dragon, add X mana of any combination of colors, spend this mana only to cast dragon spells or activate abilities of dragons. So this is fine. You're just storing a lot of counters so that when you want to cast a big dragon, you have that option. Haven of the Spirit Dragon is pretty good in this deck too, because you add a colorless mana, but most importantly, you could tap, add 1 mana of any color, and you can spend this mana to cast a dragon creature spell. Not only that, you could pay 2, tap it, sacrifice this land, return target dragon creature card or Ugin Planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. Most likely we're going to be using this just for dragons. I don't have Ugin in this deck specifically, but again, this is great if we have a dragon in our graveyard that we want to cast later on. We could just sacrifice this and return it to our hand. And the last one, Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon, is excellent in this deck, and I would say it's better than the rest of these other ones. It's very similar to Haven. We're going to tap for a colorless and add 1 mana of any color to cast a dragon spell, and also an omen spell, which is a new kind of spell. Also, you pay for and tap it, sacrifice this land, search your library for a dragon card, reveal it, put it to your hand, then shuffle. So this is basically just a dragon tutor for 4 and tapping it. You do have to sacrifice it. That's the one big downside. But again, if you're in the late game, you have a lot of mana, and if you need a game-winning play, that option is there for you. But if you want your dragon spells to resolve, Cavern of Souls is probably one of the best lands you could throw on this list. I don't need to go into how good it is. You just choose dragon, and dragon spells you cast with this mana can't be countered. That's simple enough. There's also some other utility lands that you could throw in here, like Boseiju Who Endures, or even Otawara Soaring City. These act as great removal. Arena of Glory is incredible in this deck because it gives a creature haste. Of course, you do have to exert Arena of Glory, but if you're casting your commander with this type of mana, not only will it enter the battlefield, it can attack right away, getting 2 different triggers and cheating in 2 different dragons. Arena of Glory is so good, especially in this type of deck. I don't need to go super in depth with all the lands. Those are just some of my picks as far as the best ones you could put in the deck, but I wanted to shift my focus into card draw, and there's a ton of options that you could list in this. I will say most of them are creature reliant. Something like Return of the Wild Speaker, draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. So if we just have our commander out on the battlefield, we are drawing 7 cards. A step above that would be the Last March of the Ents. This is basically a game winner in multiple instances. You draw cards equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control. So again, going back to our commander, it would be 7. Then put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. If you notice in this list specifically, there are a ton of dragons. We definitely won't whiff with this kind of spell. And the best part is this spell can't be countered. So all that mana investment into 8, you get to just draw that many cards and put any creatures on the battlefield. This card has seriously won me so many different games. It's absolutely ridiculous. Another card that I think is perfect for this kind of deck, because we have a huge amount of dragons with huge power. Great or good, you're just sacrificing a dragon, draw that many cards, and then discard 3 cards. In my big beefy creature decks, this is excellent. And in this kind of deck, it's even good too, because we're cheating in dragons with our commander. And if it's a dragon that's necessarily not going to give us any value, well, we could just sacrifice it, draw cards, and then discard some cards. And it's a sticky enchantment on the battlefield. To me personally, in a lot of different games that I've played, Great or Good has drawn me the most cards out of any other card draw engine, even including Rhystic Study in all my games I've ever played. So if there's any other card draw engine to throw in this deck, this would absolutely be it. And let's talk about one more card draw option. This is actually from the precon itself, Will of the Teamer. It is absolutely incredible. Choose one. If you control your commander as you cast a spell, you may choose both instead. The first mode reads, create a token that's a copy of a target permanent, except it's a 4/4 dragon creature with flying in addition to its other types. And the second mode does read, target player draws cards equal to the greatest highest mana value among permanents you control. So notice on the first part, you create a token that's a copy of target permanent, so it's any permanent on the battlefield, whether it's a land, artifact, enchantment, or another creature. You're going to make it into a dragon, but that's completely okay, because essentially you get to copy the best permanent on the battlefield. And of course with the second mode, if your commander's out on the battlefield, you get to draw 7 cards just straight up. And I do like how these stack with each other. If there's something like Temp CMC on the battlefield, you copy that. That ability will follow up with drawing 10 cards if you have your commander out on the battlefield. So that is just something to note. So seriously, this is one incredible card. I'm super excited to play around with it. So I talked about some of the basics. I talked about ramp, the type of lands you want to put in the deck, and card draw. I do want to follow up with some interaction that you could put in the deck. I usually like my interaction to be cheap, efficient. Since we are in blue, I did want to highlight some counter spells. An Offer You Can't Refuse, Swan Song, Strict Serenade are all great 1 mana options. They do give your opponent a bird, or depending on if you cast an Offer You Can't Refuse, you give an opponent 2 treasure tokens, which is a minimal downside, especially compared to what your opponents could be casting. But I would say easily the best interaction you could throw on this list as far as counter spells go is Mana Drain. This is essentially a ritual, also while countering a spell, and a lot of people say, hey, you're just countering this spell all just to ramp a little bit further, and yeah, that's pretty much what you're doing half the time. But if somebody's casting a high CMC spell, most likely it's going to be bad for the table, so you want to counter it anyways and get some mana out of it. I also like using interaction like flicker spells. Planar Incision or even Ghostly Flicker can help protect our commander, all the while getting the extra ETB of cheating another dragon in, and most likely the other dragon that we can flicker also will have an ETB trigger. So flicker spells are obviously other cards that you could throw in the list, and they'll do wonders for you. They could be used offensively to get extra ETBs, also while being defensive. If somebody goes for a removal spell like a Swords of Plowshares against your dragon, you can just flicker it, have it re-enter the battlefield, and that spell will fizzle. There are also a ton of other interactions that you could throw in here. Removal is another option, but I'm not going to dive into that too much. So let's move on to the next subject. So in this deck, we want to have our dragons swinging and keep on swinging. First of all, haste outlets are going to be incredible in this deck. The most notable one is Dragon Tempest. Whenever a creature you control with flying enters, it gains haste until end of turn. This is perfect. Our commander could potentially get 2 triggers in 1 turn with the ETB trigger and swinging in right away. Of course, there's other dragons that could utilize haste as well. Not only that, this could be potentially a win con, because whenever a dragon you control enters, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of dragons you control. Since it is any target, it can remove an option or just be player removal depending on how much dragons you do have on the battlefield. Another great haste option is Rhythm of the Wild. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and most importantly, non-token creatures you control have riot, so they enter the battlefield of your choice of a 1/1 counter on it or haste. This is the type of effect where, of course, we have big creatures, we want them entering the battlefield without being countered. This will help provide that, all the while giving them haste, and if we already have a haste outlet, we can just give that dragon a +1/+1 counter instead. So this is pretty versatile. Another versatile card that works as a haste outlet or card draw is Frostcliff Siege. I really love this one. You could choose Jeskai or Temur, and depending on if you already have a haste outlet on the battlefield, you may want to choose Jeskai. Jeskai does read whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card, so this is pretty efficient. If you swing at 3 different players, you get to draw 3 cards. And on the Temur side, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain trample and haste. So not only are our creatures getting haste, they are getting trample too, and some of our dragons don't even have trample, so this will help provide us a way to get through for some more combat damage, all the while buffing up our creatures too, getting +1/+0. I love how versatile this is. If we already have a lot of haste outlets on the battlefield, there's no need to get Temur. We could just choose Jeskai, get some more card advantage going. But if we don't have a haste outlet and we want to swing in for some combat damage, definitely choose Temur. But why stop there at haste with this aggressive strategy? Let's go into extra combats. Extra combats are going to be absolutely insane in this deck. With Ureni, it does have an attack trigger, so we want to keep that ball going and bringing the party to our opponents with our huge army of dragons.
I'm bringing the party to you.
I don't see how that's a party.
So what kind of extra combats do we want in this deck? One of the ones that will get us the value because it's versatile is Great Train Heist. It has 3 different spree modes. You could choose 1 or additional costs. The first spree mode, you could pay additional 3 to untap all creatures you control. If it's your combat phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. The next mode, for paying 2 mana, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike till end turn. And on the last mode, paying 1 red mana, choose target opponent. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player that turn, create a tapped treasure token. token. This is good because of course if we get into the extra combat, we'll make 2 treasure tokens instead of 1. So again, this is pretty versatile because we could choose one of those modes or all of those modes depending on which one would best suit us at that moment. Another great one would be Seize the Day. This is a classic. You're only untapping one target creature. Obviously you want to untap your commander at this point. You get an extra combat all for 4 mana and it has that flashback cost, and you can get an additional combat after that one too. With the more combats, that means more attack triggers with our commander or other creatures that I'll discuss later on. Another excellent choice, and personally one of my favorite options as far as extra combats go, is Last Night Together. You pay 5 mana, choose 2 target creatures, untap them, put 2 1/1 counters on each of them. They gain Vigilance, Indestructible, and Haste until end of turn. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase. Only the chosen creatures can attack during that combat phase. And what I find really good about this is if we swing in with our commander, get another dragon on the battlefield without haste, we could cast this spell targeting our commander and that other dragon that just entered the battlefield, giving it haste, Indestructible, and Vigilance, and also the 2 1/1 counters, and have that dragon that once entered swinging in. And the last extra combat spell I want to focus on, and one that could potentially win you the game, is Savage Beating. You can only cast it during your turn and only during combat. You choose one, or you can pay 2 additional mana to entwine it so that you can choose both. Creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn. That is really good, especially with our commander. Giving a double strike will deal 14 damage. And not only that, you could untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. That is also perfect too, because if we just swing at one of our opponents with our commander, giving a double strike and getting the extra combat, it'll deal 28 damage, and obviously it deals more than 21 damage, making it commander lethal. So this one could definitely close out games, especially the more dragons you have on the battlefield swinging in and attacking him, giving them double strike and an extra combat. Also, I do have a personal bias towards extra combats. You could also go the extra turn route, but I wouldn't recommend that too much, mainly because people absolutely don't like playing against that kind of strategy. So of course this is a dragon deck after all. We want to have the best of the best in our arsenal to take over the game. I did want to first highlight some Omen dragons that are very good for the deck because they're great at the beginning of the game and also late in the game. Something like Bloomvine Regent will help us ramp in the early game, and when it enters in the late game it could gain us some life. Whirlwing Stormbrood could put 3/1 counters on a target creature we control, buffing it up, and on the other side give us a tempo plan of casting dragons and sorcery spells at flash speed. And Runescale Stormbrood can act as a counter spell and can buff itself up when you're casting dragon spells and non-creature spells. I like this one in particular because this one can protect us even though it's limited to 2 CMC or less. A lot of removal based options or even counter spells are usually 2 CMC. I've never really seen any counter spells or removal spells 3 CMC or higher in a long time, so this one can help protect our dragons. And I mentioned this when I first talked about Ureni. These Omen dragons work particularly well. I know a lot of people have been not a big fan of them. However, in this type of deck where we're looking at the top 8 cards of our library, and if one of them happens to be in there and no other dragons, hey, well guess what? We get to put that directly on the battlefield because we shuffled it in, playing it in the early game. I feel like this is the only time where the Omen dragons are actually pretty good. Outside of that, I'm not totally sure. I also love the idea of going wide with a lot of different dragons. I already mentioned Dragonback Assault. I also like Udvara Hellkite and Lathless Dragon Queen because they'll consistently put dragons on our side of the battlefield, whether we're attacking with Udvara Hellkite and other dragons, or if they're just simply entering the battlefield another non-token dragon, we get to put additional 5/5 red dragon creature token with Lathless. If you want to add some additional dragons that have great removal, Dragon Lord Atarka, along with a better upgraded version, Ureni the Song Unending. These both are perfect for the deck because we just splash these on the battlefield, remove a couple creatures on the battlefield. Ureni is obviously a little better because we are putting a lot of lands on the battlefield, and the more we have, the more we can deal damage with it. And not going to mention the fact that it does have protection from white and black. Those are basically the best removal options in Commander. So most of the time this is probably going to swing in and deal a ton of damage, and not many people can do anything about it. Another sort of removal option as far as dragons go is Hammerhead Tyrant. This is from the precon. Whenever you cast a spell, so any kind of spell, whether it's an instant sorcery, artifact, creature, return up to 1 non-land permanent and opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to that spell's mana value to the owner's hand. So this is most likely going to trigger and bounce anything on the battlefield because we're casting a lot of huge dragons. This is like a depowered version of Hullbreaker Horror, but still pretty good. There are some other dragons that could essentially help you win the game because they have all your other dragons deal double the damage in some sort of way. Twin Flame Tyrant and Atarka Worldrender. Technically Atarka is not dealing double damage, but you're giving all your attacking dragons double strike, which is essentially double. Twin Flame Tyrant, if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent and opponent controls, it deals double that damage instead. And just imagine 2 of these on the battlefield. Atarka would be swinging in for 24 damage, and Twin Flame Tyrant would be swinging in for 12. 12. And the possibilities are endless depending on what kind of dragons you have on the battlefield, especially if you're going wide with all the options I mentioned previously. Giving them all double strike or double damage is going to definitely close out the game. Also, you could throw in the Ancient Dragon cycle, Ancient Silver Dragon, Ancient Copper Dragon, and Ancient Bronze Dragon. At the luck of the dice, you could either draw a ton of cards, make a ton of treasure, or put a lot of 1/1 counters on creatures. But I would say probably one of my favorite dragons of the entire set is Broodcaller Scourge. This is absolutely incredible in this deck, and I gotta say, this synergizes so well with our commander. For 5 and 2 green, it has flying, and whenever one or more dragons you control deal combat damage to a player, you may put a permanent card with mana value less than or equal to that damage from your hand onto the battlefield. So this could help cheat things in. And just a little side note, if you have this swinging at one opponent and 2 other dragons swinging at 2 different opponents, you get to cheat 3 things in depending on the damage of each opponent. Or you could just swing at one opponent if you have a big high CMC card that you want to cast. You can just swing all those creatures directly at one opponent and then cheat that spell in. Also, what makes this so good is the fact that it is a deals combat trigger and it's any dragon. And look at that, our commander does have an attack trigger. Let's just say we swing in with our commander and then we cheat and Broodcaller Scourge on the battlefield. After it enters the battlefield, we connect with our opponent with our commander dealing 7 damage. That means we could cheat in something 7 CMC or less directly onto the battlefield, and that does include lands, by the way, because their mana value is 0. So yeah, seriously, if there's any other dragon to throw in the deck, this is by far one of the best ones you could utilize, cheating in more permanents along with your commander. Of course, you can also double up on all your dragons, putting Miirym Sentinel Worm in the deck. Even if they're legendary or non-legendary, you're making a token of them when they enter the battlefield. I didn't want to discuss Miirym too much because it's obviously infamous, but it can fit in the 99 because it's in the color identity. So now that I've talked about some of the best dragons you could utilize in the deck, I wanted to focus on closing out the game, and there are plenty of ways to do this. Of course, you could just go out and swing in with all your dragons and close out the game that way, or there are some combos that you could utilize in the deck. Of course, for an extra combats, you could use like something like Aggravated Assault and Old Gnawbone. There are other versions of these kind of effects with Old Gnawbone, like Ancient Copper Dragon. Of course, you have to roll greater than 5, or you could utilize another dragon like Savage Ventmaw, where as long as you're producing 5 CMC or higher, you could pay into that cost of Aggravated Assault, swing again with your army, pay into that cost again, and go back and forth killing your opponents with your flying dragons. This also can work with Hellkite Charger. When it attacks, you may pay 5 and 2 red. If you do untap all attacking creatures after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. This is a little bit harder than Aggravated Assault because you have to attack with Hellkite Charger, and you have to have enough mana to pay into that the first time because it is an attack trigger. And with something like Old Gnawbone, you have to connect with the dragon first to get the treasure to pay into that cost, so you need to have enough mana previously to pay into that first extra combat, but then after that it's all gravy. You can get into infinite combats that way. Another way you could win the game is by using Food Chain. This combo is more of a combo used in CDH. However, if you're in a high powered setting like this deck, you should totally take advantage of it because Ureni of the Unwritten has an amazing ETB of cheating dragons into play. And what I like about Food Chain is the fact that you can kind of just go back and forth. If you don't have something like Squee the Immortal to get infinite mana with, you could just sacrifice the creature that enters the battlefield with Ureni of the Unwritten, and if you have the other extra mana, you pay into it, and then recast Ureni, get another dragon into the battlefield, sacrifice that and Ureni, kind of go back and forth until you could find a loop of a win. But of course, if you wanted more consistency, use something like Squee the Immortal, which is kind of perfect because usually goblins are dragon fodder. You just sacrifice Squee to Food Chain back and forth, gaining infinite mana only to cast creature spells. Then what you'll do is cast your commander, get that ETB, put a dragon on the battlefield, and if you put something like Terror of the Peaks or Scourge of Valkis on the battlefield, you can essentially win the game by recasting your commander over and over again, blasting everybody in the face to victory. Because Terror of the Peaks has that enter the battlefield trigger whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control. Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target, and the same can be applied for Scourge of Valkis. Whenever it or another dragon enters the battlefield under your control, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of dragons you control. So essentially you're just pinging everybody to death, and that's honestly the greatest way to win at a dragon deck, by breathing fire down to your opponents. So yep, nothing brings me more joy than this. Extra combats and getting infinite combats, and using Food Chain, because Food Chain is one of my favorite infinite combos in Magic the Gathering. So this is everything I want in a commander deck, and that's why I plan on building it myself. All the cards that you see on screen and in the deck list are cards that I plan on using too. But I would love to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts down below in the comments? Are there other dragons that I didn't mention in this video that you would like to highlight? I just can't tell you how excited I am am for this commander. I do believe this is more explosive than Miirym because of the attack triggers and enter the battlefield triggers that you could utilize with infinite mana, and the fact that you could cheat in dragons is just chef's kiss. You have to cast the dragons with Miirym and have them enter the battlefield. Of course, Miirym is still pretty powerful, making token copies of dragons either legendary or non-legendary, but again, I find Ureni much more interesting and more of my playstyle. So if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.